Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. My name's Adam Hawksby. I'm Deputy Director of the think tank Onward, and from, I think, this afternoon, Chair of the government's Towns Unit, working part of the week to help them deliver their 1.1 billion long-term plan for towns. I've now got to get that plug in every event I do. And it's actually in towns that this project started, came about. So there are a few things that make our reports successful. Firstly, something that makes us curious and interested, something we spot in the course of our research that we want to know more about and want to understand. And it was in our work in towns often described as kind of left behind parts of the country that we saw philanthropists quietly but very effectively supporting state efforts, civil society efforts to renew and regenerate their places. And it was from that kind of kernel of curiosity that Shivani embarked upon this report. The second thing you really need is a community of people that are interested in this work and frankly have done a lot of the foundational research already. And for this project, we kind of sat on the shoulders of philanthropic giants, not just individuals themselves and the work they've given, but organizations like Pro Bono Economics, the Beacon Collective, who provided a whole amount of their data, and of course CAF, who not only worked with us throughout the project, but have been kind enough to support the work today. The third thing you really need, though, is some political interest, right? A topic could be as exciting and a community as active as you want, but if you don't have a landing spot in politics and in Westminster, then a think tank's report really is going to go nowhere. And so we were really pleased right at the beginning of this project, when we started having discussions with the culture sector and with her team, that they were really clear this was an area that was a priority and somewhere where they were extraordinarily open to ideas and to taking action. And we're going to hear about some of that today. So what we're going to do is have a speech and some opening remarks from the Right Honourable Lucy Frazer MP, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. You're then going to get a taster of the report from Shivani, a mere snippet that's going to mean you're going to run away and immediately download it and send it to all of your friends. And then we're going to have a discussion with a panel that I'll introduce just before they speak. But firstly, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker this morning to share some of her thoughts on philanthropy and what her department will be doing to support it. Please give a really warm welcome to the Right Honourable Lucy Frazer, MP.
Good morning, everybody. And thanks very much, Adam. And thank you to the whole team at Onward for putting on this important event today. I wanted to start by talking about some of my thoughts on lions. And I wanted to start with a story of two young men in a desert. The two men see a lion facing them, and one of them bends down and puts on his trainers. And the other says, "Why are you doing that? You'll never run faster than the lion." And he turns to his friend and he says, "No, I won't run faster than the lion, but I will run faster than you." It's a story about sometimes how we think about ourselves and not about others, because in fact, whilst one man is definitely not going to defeat a lion, it's possible that working with others, 2, 10 or 20, survival might ensue. It's possible that if we think not just always of ourselves, but how we can work with others, we can achieve so much more. And I tell that story today because we're talking about philanthropy. The UK, as a nation, has thrived because it believes fundamentally in community. Community has been the bedrock of life in this country, serving as a network that draws us all together, supporting those who have the least. And in the UK, we have a strong tradition of wealthy industrialists and business leaders who give back to the communities of which they are a part. We had the Cadburys in Birmingham, the Lever brothers on the Wirral, and the mill owners in Manchester and Bradford, like Sir Titus Salt. They understood that they had a duty to their local communities, one that went simply beyond their relationship as employer and employee. It was linked to the well-being of society as a whole, a society that they were all part of. And it was about building philanthropic ties with their local communities. Of course, the world has moved on today. After World War II, the creation and extension of the welfare state meant that government came to assume a critical role in delivering what had previously simply been left to others. The provision of health services, financial support, employment when you were out of employment, and when you were sick. And of course, it is the absolute responsibility of any government to protect and support those in our society, particularly the most disadvantaged. But while government is and must continue to be integral to helping people, it can't and should not always be the only answer. Government should be part of a partnership, and it has a role in ensuring that the partnership is an effective one. Government should ensure that the frameworks are there to enable others to give and to facilitate that giving. And it's beyond doubt that the British society is playing an important role and is already very generous. The recent annual report from the Charities Aid Foundation found donations to charity in 2022 reached a record £12.7 billion, up from £10.7 billion the year before. But it's interesting to read in the Onward report the challenges that continue to exist in this area. That some of the more fortunate have historically given more. Philanthropy is not always reaching the places where it is needed most, and the benefits, therefore, of philanthropy are not being felt evenly across the country. So we need to consider how we in government can do more work with those who can and want to do more. This is a core priority for me. It's something that I've been looking at since I was appointed as Secretary of State for DCMS, and so I massively welcome Onward's contribution to this important debate. And I want to focus our efforts on three main areas: enabling, encouraging, and recognizing philanthropy. We need to maximize the untapped potential that exists right across society. So I'm looking closely and building on work already in train across government on many of the things that have been identified in the report. Streamlining gift aid, working with the FCA and the Treasury to explore the possibility of greater philanthropic training, and promoting and supporting stronger regional and partnership giving. Because if we can get that formula right, we can encourage even more organizations and people to give. But I also think it's right to recognize that as a nation, we are sometimes squeamish about talking about what we earn and what we give. Sometimes we're reluctant to recognize wealth as a positive force in our society. And often worse, we denigrate those who succeed and those who give. A big part of the equation is unashamedly championing philanthropy. And for that, I believe we need a collective attitudes shift, a hopeful message. Philanthropists and would-be philanthropists need to know that not only do we recognize their giving, we celebrate it. Onward's illuminating report really highlights the fact that we have a tendency to view philanthropic giving, particularly by businesses, with mild suspicion. What's the agenda? What do they stand to gain? This scrutiny almost automatically assumes that those who give are motivated by cynicism or an act of PR to improve their public image. A desire for transparency is absolutely a healthy one, but sometimes it clouds our judgment and discourages would-be philanthropists. We need these individuals, these businesses, these groups, and it's complacent to think otherwise. In the United States, they celebrate their great philanthropists, from Bill and Melinda Gates and Michael Bloomberg to Mackenzie Scott. More can undoubtedly be done to create a positive giving environment at home, one that recognizes, as the chair of the Charity Commission, Orlando Frazer, has said, giving is good for those who give, it's good for those who benefit, and it's good for society as a whole. So it has to start with applauding, not seeking to find fault with those organizations who give generously, whether that's through sponsorship or donations. Just look at the last few years. The Science Museum forced to abandon its backing of Shell. The National Portrait Gallery received a great deal of unwarranted criticism for its sponsorship by a law firm. So it's for its recent commitment of £50 million to the British Museum, the biggest donation of its kind, I think we should say to BP, thank you. The ultimate beneficiaries of these sponsorships are all of us. While government funding sustains free entry and access to our world-leading museums and art galleries, exceptional acts of generosity such as donations and sponsorships are key to widening access to great artworks and cultural treasures. They help to drive tourism in the UK, and they help us to retain our soft power abroad. And when we work together, national government, local government, collaborations, supporting local areas, that works even better. We should applaud our new philanthropic networks like Made in Stoke, which is reviving a trend of local philanthropy that dates back to the Victorian era. The 18th century ceramic tycoon and one of Stoke's best-known entrepreneurs, Josiah Wedgwood, famously built a model village for workers in the Staffordshire potteries, which set an example for decades to come. Today, the Made in Stoke network is bringing together local universities, football clubs, charities, philanthropists, and the City Council to reinvest in the place that made them successful. Matthew Bocock, who is one of the network's champions, neatly summed up their aim as harnessing the fierce pride and loyalty felt by people born, raised, and somehow connected to this city. To date, Made in Stoke has led to a £10,000 investment into sports activities for children, £50,000 going to dance and ballet classes for children. Made in Stoke is a real partnership, one that benefits from local government money, local money, and philanthropic giving. And that partnership brings together Stoke donors who are willing and able to work hand in hand with the City Council and community organisations to deliver for the people in the city. It's a hugely successful partnership of a kind that we should replicate across the country. Jason Stockwood, who's on the panel today, is a great example of the kind of philanthropy that we want to champion. I know Jason has talked about his motivation as chair of the Grimsby Horizon Youth Zone and how he felt he had an opportunity as an entrepreneur to make a difference. He's doing that through the Youth Zone, through Grimsby Town Football Club, and Onside's Grimsby Centre. And Jason isn't alone. So Roger DeHaan, whose wealth comes from the Saga Holiday Company, has changed the face of the port of Folkestone after buying its harbour for £11 million in 2004 and rejuvenating it. His commitment to Folkestone has helped to turn around the fortunes of the town and transformed the High Street, which is now called the Creative Quarter, full of bars and art galleries enjoyed by locals. Jonathan Ruffer, the former investment banker, has donated around £120 million to his local hometown of Bishop Auckland to ensure it retains its amazing heritage from the Auckland Tower and Auckland Castle to the Spanish Gallery. And Jonathan's focus has gone beyond preserving what was already there. Thanks to his backing, the palace now has a museum on the history of Christianity and faith in Britain. Or take Andrew Law, the hedge fund chief executive, who's quietly backed causes from the Lowry Theatre Complex in Salford to Maggie's Cancer Centres and Robert Peston's Speakers for Schools. 2 years ago, Andrew gave £6 million to the University of Sheffield, where he was educated, to encourage applications from poorer teenagers and to fund research into gene therapy, the biggest single donation in the university's 116-year history. There are positive examples like this up and down this country. They are evidence, if ever it were needed, of the huge difference that philanthropy can and does make. They're a major reason why my outlook is an overwhelmingly positive one. And the enduring strength of philanthropy in the UK reflects our recognition of our common humanity. That's why a third of us gave money to Ukraine when the war broke out in 2021. That's why giving nationally increased by £2 billion last year. But we can go further. And we must and can find ways to give more. Creating a policy environment that makes giving easier and more rewarding. Growing the core wealth of individuals, reinvesting in the local areas that help to make them who they are today. Recognizing the individuals and groups that give back. When lions come our way, let's fight them together in our communities not alone. So let's be unashamedly positive about philanthropy in this country, and let's work together to make sure that more can happen.
Thank you so much for those comments, Secretary of State. We're now going to turn to the author of today's report, Shivani Menon, who's going to talk us through some of the findings. Shivani.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for making it to Onward's launch event for our report on philanthropy. I am Shivani H. Menon. I'm a senior researcher on Onward's Leveling Up program and the author of the report Giving Back Better. As Adam mentioned earlier, over the course of our Leveling Up work, we've come across very many inspiring and promising projects across the country, whether that's in North Birkenhead, in Grimsby, or in Bishop Auckland, and all had philanthropists, their foundations, or their grant funding very silently tucked away behind the scenes. So this really made us take a step back and ask ourselves the question of why we don't see a lot more of this happening across the country. Today, I'm delighted to share the findings of the report with you here today. But before I begin, I would like to clarify what really it is that we are looking at. We are looking at donations of money from high net worth individuals, so your top 1% of earners and wealth holders. And the reason we've selected this group is because the scale, scope, and significance of their donations vary greatly from a £20 donation that the general public might make at a charity shop. In terms of scale, high net worth philanthropy is sized to be about 8 billion in donations annually, and that's about a fourth of all donations received from the public. In terms of scope, philanthropy operates differently to the state and markets. It does what governments sometimes can't and markets sometimes won't. And in terms of significance, charitable giving from individuals is the largest income source for charities of all sizes. Today, I will share with you 3 trends we've identified, 2 of the drivers, and some of the ideas on how we can boost philanthropy in the UK. On trends, we found that the top earners are donating proportionately less than the poorest 10%, at half the rate of the poorest 10. And in real terms, this is about lost annual donations of £3.4 billion. They're also donating less relative to the growth of their income. Analysis from Pro Bono found that while income has increased by about 21% from 2012 to 19, donations have fallen by 11%. Too few wealthy donors have been participating in philanthropy. Looking at donations from the wealthiest 1% of households, almost half of donations came from just 5% of that group, which is very concerning because it makes for an unsustainable philanthropic model. And we found that high net worth donors are donating to too few places. Gift aid donations made out of London were 4 times higher than the national average, and even tracing the regional grant-making footprint of some of Britain's biggest philanthropic foundations, we see that London receives a third of all donations despite hosting just 14% of the UK population. Why is this happening? We've identified a range of factors, but today I will share 2 with you. The first being gift aid. It is complex and widely misunderstood among the donor population. About £564 million goes unclaimed by charities each year, and 2/3 of high net worth donors do not even claim the relief through gift aid that they're eligible for. And the reason most widely cited was that it was poor levels of awareness, it was too complicated to use, they didn't know how much relief was split. The second driver we identified is that philanthropy advice, the landscape for it is very fragmented. Only 1 in 5 professional advice firms offer advice on philanthropy, and donors very rarely make these decisions themselves. They are assisted by a team of advisors that help shape their philanthropy strategy, and they're left knocking on multiple doors to seek comprehensive advice. What do we recommend happens to boost philanthropy? First, on growing giving, we believe that HMRC should automate the gift aid process so that donors can both make their donation and claim their rebate on the same platform and in a single step. This would lead to about 520 million extra in terms of donations for charities. We talk about how the Financial Conduct Authority should make philanthropy training a mandatory part of training that's provided to individual advisors. We talk about how the government should launch a national philanthropy strategy, bringing together DCMS, HMRC, HMT, and the Charity Commission, all the departments that are doing great work on philanthropy, together, and that this strategy should be led by an externally appointed philanthropy champion. But growing giving alone won't be enough. We need to make sure that it reaches the places that most need it. So we talk about launching a series of charitable action zones. These are geographically targeted zones that would benefit from an additional pot of funding called the philanthropy match, that donations made into these places would be topped up by government. And we talk about creating, that was spoken about earlier today, this diaspora model of philanthropy. People that have a strong connection to places across the UK, whether that's where they grew up, whether that's where they lived and worked, leveraging that relationship to secure donations for these places. There's a lot more analysis, recommendations, and information on our report that I would urge you all to read after this event. Thank you for your time, and I will now move on to the next panelist.
Thank you so much. When you're coming to appoint your external philanthropy champion, you could do a lot worse than Shivani H. Menon. So we're going to come to a discussion now. We'll stay seated for this portion. Let me just introduce the three people that are going to respond to some of those remarks. We have already mentioned today this morning Jason Stockwood. Jason's done phenomenal work in Grimsby, previously a tech entrepreneur, went and became the chairman of Grimsby Town FC after purchasing the club, and through Our Future, which he runs with Emily Bolton, doing some really phenomenal work in that town to understand the root causes of some of the challenges that they face. On the far left of the panel, we have Paul Ramsbottom, the chief executive of the Walsam Foundation, one of the kind of 10 organisations that we profiled there that are responsible for distributing a huge amount of philanthropic funding across the UK. But Paul himself is a kind of thinker and speaker on philanthropy, and I believe has started his own charitable foundation too, which he might talk about in his remarks. And then just to Paul's left, we have Neil Heslop, who runs CAF, the Charities Aid Foundation, an organisation who have been really instrumental in the development of this research, have been championing a number of the issues we're discussing today. And I think what Neil can do in his remarks, hopefully, is add some nuance to some of these trends that we're seeing, I think, in two areas particularly. One, on this issue of the wealthy giving less. They might be giving more in absolute terms, less proportionately. How should we think about that to motivate those givers? And also this issue of incentives versus institutions. We found in our research that while a lot of the focus is sometimes on things like gift aid or the amount of rebate a donor can claim, the ecosystem and the institutions around giving might actually be more important than the amount that you can claim back or the amount of match you might receive. So some of those comments I hope we'll receive from Neil in just a moment. But Jason, let's get some opening thoughts from you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Jason. I'm from Grimsby. I used to sell business insurance. That's normally a way of clearing a room, that introduction. But I was a tech entrepreneur for nearly 25 years. And actually, it's interesting what Lucy said there. He's a bit squeamish being sat here. So that's something about the psyche of us Brits, I think, that actually to be represented and giving you a view on philanthropy. I grew up very working class. I'm a council estate kid from Grimsby originally, and I moved away when I was 18. I'll just talk a little bit about the context of how my family, it's my wife and I, focus on the work that we focus on. I was really fortunate in 2017. I was invited to go back to university as a fellow and think about some of these topics. After I'd finished my career, I was worried about sort of the political trends in the country, and particularly for towns like Grimsby. I live near Manchester now, but sort of post-industrial towns. And one of the things I had an instinct for, but as I went into the sort of the literature and understood it, was just this idea of luck. And whilst a relatively trivial idea, it always struck me as really odd as I've had my career that I'm always really suspicious of people that fully own their success. And what I mean by that is that you meet a lot of entrepreneurs who think they're brilliant and all the things they've done are brilliant because of them. And as you look into the writing of philosophers like John Rawls, who I'm a particular fan of, and you think about the circumstances of your birth, which are the largest determinant of your success. And mine was very auspicious. On one side, single-parent family, council estate. I did have the great good fortune of being born white, male, and at a time when the internet was being invented. And I think I mentioned that for a really important reason for me, but related to philanthropy, which is when you have that idea in your head and in your heart, you realise that there's a real moral obligation to do something with your success. And I don't mean that in a pious or grandiose way. And it's interesting, the sort of philanthropists that Lucy referenced were probably philanthropists born out of a Christian ideology, which is obviously a challenge today in a secular society. And I certainly don't have that motivation. But what I do have, and my wife has, is a real deep obligation to say that a lot of our success is down to luck. Hard work is a necessary but insufficient condition of success. I've definitely grafted, I've worked hard. But the amount of luck you have, there's a lot of people that work as hard, if not harder. And I think when you grasp that idea, there's a real motivation to do something with your network, with your resources, with your money. I also don't want kids that are little arseholes when they grow up as well. So, so I plan to give, my wife and I give most of our money away before we pass on, because that's the real motivation for doing that. I think we're doing okay, but time will tell. 12 and 15, tricky ages. So, but within all of that, so I had the dirty secret about this work as well. It's probably the hardest, but the most rewarding thing I've ever been involved in as well. So it's relational in nature, and once we realised the sort of things I wanted to get involved in, I got some great advice. And you mentioned Emily Bolton, who's a friend and an inspiration and a partner to me now in our work in our future, who've been in the space for 20 years, but working out how do you focus on things that you really care about, that speak to your soul, and how do you do things that are sustainable and for a long period, rather than being something that is transactional. So I focused on trying to rebuild the civic institution. So it's grounded in the work of a philosopher called Robert Putnam, who, capitalism is our best route towards prosperity globally. That's been proven. And yet we need to reinvigorate the social institutions that bound us for the last 50 years, whether that was the church, unions, social groups, sports groups. And so my insight and my thought when partnering with Emily was, how do we rebuild historical institutions like the football club? And by the way, a football club is definitely an act of philanthropy. That is not a business that I would advise for anyone to get involved in. And then with the amazing good fortune to meet the team at Onside Youth. So to anybody here that's thinking about philanthropy, it's an amazing model whereby they have central infrastructure that they need people who want to champion a particular youth zone being built, but do all the heavy lifting in terms of governance and national foundations and the project management building youth facilities. And again, there's been some great government support in that. It just shows that if you get philanthropists and the right private organisation, then the Youth Investment Fund has sort of come in behind that and funded a lot of that work as well. And then the final piece for me is actually making sure that it's grounded in place. Because for me, this work will be the work of my lifetime now. It's not something that I could or want to walk away from because it's the place that I'm from. But that means it's relational in nature as well. And so for me, the ability to go back to a place that I love, my brothers lived there, my mum lived there till last year, till she passed, but all my friends from school and people I've been connected with. And as I've gone on this sort of international career with the things that I've done, I used to go back to Grimsby 8 or 9 times a year to watch the football club, usually lose. But actually it's enabled me to go back at sort of 53 years old and reinvigorate relationships with people I love and care about. And it was a surprise to me, because I'd sort of forgotten that I was missing that in my life. And so again, the secret of all this work, while it can look like you're doing something that benefits a community, the reward is as good, if not greater, for people that get involved in this, because the relationships you get and the work that you're able to do is profoundly enriching. And it's hard, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, but at the same time, really positive for the long term. So I guess the two things for me were from the report that I really liked, by the way, and congratulations to Shivani and Adam on this, because I hadn't done a lot of thought about the opportunities to enhance this, but I really liked the charitable action zones. We think about the opportunity of levelling up that has been a challenge, quite frankly, and will continue to be a challenge for the next 10 years. But actually the idea, if we could bring real focus onto areas that gave tax breaks or really put the spotlight on a region for a while, I'm convinced there are people that would step into that conversation. And then, look, gift aid's took a bit of a bashing already, but I do think it's anything you have to print off a form to fill out, it's like I'm out of that straight away, just by the way that my mind works. But I do think there's a massive opportunity there. But just thanks for listening. I'll be around for a short while afterwards, and thanks to to Onward for the report. I think it's really stimulating and provocative, so well done.
Paul, great to get your thoughts.
Thank you, and let me just echo other comments congratulating Onward and Shivani, you in particular, for an excellent report. Well, let me begin with a story, and that's the story of the Wolfson family, who fled persecution in Eastern Europe in the 1890s and came to late Victorian Glasgow. It was there that Isaac Wolfson was born in 1897. He created a very successful retail business. And so by the 1950s, was in a position to be able to set up a foundation, the Wolfson Foundation, to give back to the society that had given his family refuge and had allowed him to prosper. So fast forward 7 decades, that foundation has given away in real terms about £2 billion, largely to research and education, and still has an endowment of 1 billion. Now, the story of Isaac Wolfson and the Wolfsons is by no means unique. We've just heard Jason's own inspiring story. But I think one of the things that the report really highlights is that it is still too rare in British society. And I think the most uncomfortable piece of the report for me was that confirmation that essentially, and perhaps I'm putting this too crudely, the wealthier people are in British society, the less proportionately they tend to give to charity. And that's clearly a challenge at a time when for civil society there are great challenges, there are great opportunities, but funding is incredibly tough. I guess, though, it is, as a stat, also an opportunity in that if we shift the dial, there are possibly very great rewards. And so I thought the beauty of the report, to a considerable extent, was that the suggestions, recommendations being made were relatively low-hanging fruit. You know, the tax system already is pretty generous in the UK. There are things that can be done to simplify. The connection of philanthropists to local communities is clearly an area for work, but we already have community foundations, very often doing great work. So I thought just for a moment or two, I might take a step back and say that alongside that, there is also surely a need to think about the culture in which we're working. And Jason hinted, I think all the research shows that there are two factors that affect whether people give in any society, predominantly above all else. First is your attitude towards government and whether you expect it to pick up the tab for most things. And secondly is religion and your religious affiliation. And in fact, research shows it doesn't especially matter which religion. And so obviously post-1945, the trend of the welfare state and secularization has meant that we need to create a different culture that encourages giving. And so just in my last 30 seconds, a few thoughts on that to kind of aid discussion. I think we need to think about schools, education in schools, and embedding giving as part of what it means to be a good citizen. Whether you go on to be prosperous or less prosperous, it's just there, and it's part of who we are. I think there's a lot we can learn from the States in terms of circles of giving and peer support and peer encouragement. There's a bit of that in the UK, more in the US. We might come to that in discussion. The public discourse is often problematic. And let's be honest, sometimes that's because philanthropy itself is problematic. And in a way, you can't expect media to be anything other than cynical, perhaps. But I think perhaps it's incumbent on those of us involved in philanthropy to also think about how we can get the more positive messages more prominently out there. And perhaps, as Jason said, to be a little bit less awkward about talking about it. And then the last thing, which can often be overlooked in these kind of earnest discussions, is just to emphasize that giving is fun. You know, there's a joy in it. It may be a social and civic responsibility, but actually it's fun, it's joyful, it's wonderful, and all the stats show that the benefit accrues as much to the giver as the receiver. So thank you for the report, and I think there's a lot to think about, and wonderful to hear the Minister responding so positively to it.
Thank you so much, Paul. And finally, Neil, your thoughts.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Secretary of State. It's really, really important that the government takes this seriously and shines a great light on it. So the very fact that we're all here today having this conversation, that's profoundly important. And in the background, Lucy, I know that you're very, very personally committed to this and following it up with real action within the department to support a much greater focus on philanthropy. So thank you for that. Congratulations to Onward. Excellent report with some really, really important insights that we would have no hesitation in echoing and supporting. From a Charities Aid Foundation point of view, especially pleased to see one of the calls around the need now for a national philanthropy and charitable giving strategy, as much because of this moment in time that we're all facing. And I guess one of the questions I'm always mindful of saying, why this and why now? And I think it is indisputable that every one of us as individuals, every one of us in terms of our communities and the country as a whole benefits when together we give more. I think the complexity across the mix of motivations and individuals to some of the stakeholders that Lucy talked about in terms of individuals, businesses, whether those are very high net worth individuals, where we're having a focus here. But what I would observe is that because of where we are as a country, some of the long-term trends, both for philanthropists but also everyday givers and especially businesses, they're all saying the same thing. A smaller and smaller proportion of those communities are giving more and more. We have to celebrate that. It is enormously heartwarming that those communities are stepping up and being counted at an incredibly important time. But that's not sustainable. And the long-term trends are really quite worrying. And therefore, this conversation is profoundly important. And I was really interested, Jason, a couple of words that in your remarks. You said about luck, and you said about secret. And I think there's a couple of insights there that I would really echo from our perspective. In my job, we have the great privilege to work with 3,000 companies who are taking the step to give. We similarly have the great honor to work with 2,500 philanthropists, many of whom, like as you described, have had the combination of what they normally describe as a mix of luck, skill, and timing to have built very substantial wealth. And yet, somehow, culturally, as a country, we find it very, very difficult to really just call that for what it is, acknowledge it, celebrate it, use that as an exemplar to support and enable and encourage others to follow suit, if not else, to get the kind of payback that you've just described about the fulfillment and satisfaction that comes from giving. The motivation in our experience for giving is always built on compassion, generosity, and humanity. And we need more of those things. And therefore, that secret thing about being slightly churlish about recognizing it, calling it out, celebrating it where it's happening, using that as a nudge and a behavior and an encouragement for others to have the confidence to do the same, I think is really, really important. All of us have a vested interest in there being more giving, in the giving that takes place being innovative and impactful, and both of those things translating into much, much increased charity sector resilience and sustainability, so they can provide the support that we all want to see in the country that we want to live in. So I think in coming back to the practicality of what can be done, there is an enormous opportunity here. Yes, there's an obligation. Of course there's an obligation. But if we can center on the opportunity, get the tone right, and not the slightly shrill media headline to today's Onward. I don't know if you guys have seen the Times. That's kind of unfortunate because it masks the substance of what this report is saying. Gift aid is an easy no-win. It's fabulous. It was introduced in the early 90s. It was designed for the pre-internet age, hasn't moved on. once it gets to the point where you don't have to print something out and do it, to recognise where we are, its potential to make a real difference. Shivani talked about the 500 million. You know, it's 1.6 billion today. The work that HMRC are doing to reinvent key effect, profoundly important. The work around wealth advisors, profoundly important. There is a way to do this relatively simply, but fundamentally, it's the complexity of all these different communities, and we've got to get to a point where there is absolute commitment with some government strategy and convening and the greater use of match funding, because we know that it provides a multiplier impact right through the communities, to direct more resources more quickly to the most pressing of the social problems that we face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Okay, let's open this up to the floor, because we've got a lot of people here that I imagine will want to ask questions and make comments. Got hands flowing up already. What I'll do is I'll take them in groups of 3. I'm going to have to repeat and summarise them at the end, because we've only got mics up here at the front. So speak up and people in the room will hear you, and then I'll make sure we catch you on YouTube. So let's go for the question just at the front there. We have one over here, and then one just over there, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. My name's Martin Lejeune, and I help run a campaign called Age of Relevance, and we're raising money from businesses at the moment. So hugely in favour of the philanthropic model, and I must congratulate the panel because every contribution was great. But where I was a bit troubled by the recommendation is the stress on a massively enhanced, it seemed to me at least, role for the government in this. We already have a champion of philanthropy who spoke very eloquently at the start of the event. I do worry that whilst there's a need for more brokerage between philanthropists and charities, there's a kind of dead hand of government that could creep in if we have strategies and zones and all the rest of it. And it might actually choke off some of the creativity and entrepreneurialism that we currently see in the sector. So I'd be very interested in people's responses, particularly from the Secretary of State.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Han, just here, yeah.
Shivani said there's a £3.5 billion opportunity in terms of giving from the wealthy. I'm Grant Gordon from Ethos Foundation. I'd like to come to Paul's point about this is a cultural issue. Yes, it is a cultural issue. And then Neil, you talked about, and I think Jason mentioned secrecy. How, as a nation, do we lift the veil of secrecy on wealth so that those who are donors, you walk into the museum and you see anonymous as written on the wall. Somebody writes anonymous in stone on the wall. How do we culturally make that shift so that we can really celebrate philanthropy?
Thank you, Grant. And yeah, question there.
Hi, my name is Juliette Baldinger. Fantastic report, really looking forward to reading it. It really connects with so many thoughts buzzing around in my brain. Your speech was fantastic. Again, a collaboration, really, really relevant, and I'm afraid it makes my question to you particularly pertinent as well. I'm kind of going through an obsession at the moment about how AI can impact philanthropy, and currently bringing together some foundations to talk about how AI is going to affect them. One barrier that I don't feel anybody touched on is, in my sort of 20-odd years of philanthropy, a lot of the barriers, well, one of the barriers for wealthy individuals is they don't know where to start. You know, there is no role in England. You can't be a chartered advisor in philanthropy like can America. I know Nicole's working on it through Pro Bono Economics. But I know 360 Giving are doing a fantastic job collating the information what foundations are doing. But as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, there is no government database report about all the amazing things you do, all the projects you've supported, all the good things that have happened, all the mistakes that have happened. And in my AI head, I would love the idea of who I could talk to about it, to basically get the government to talk about all the amazing things they've done, or the foundations to talk about all the amazing things they've done, and it will help the philanthropists figure out where the gaps are, because they can see where all the money's going, but then they can also identify areas that aren't being looked into. So I don't quite know how to target the government for that question. So I'm afraid
Excellent.
you're getting it.
No, that's great. The debate in microcosm. The government's doing too much, the government should do something else. Okay, very good. So let's, just the three questions we have. Martin, on what the government's role should be. Is there a risk that the dead hand of the state gets in the way of civic action? Grant, on how do we get away from the secrecy around wealth and be able to kind of both celebrate, recognise, but also then direct it more effectively. From Juliet there on what's the role of the government in kind of giving advice, helping to lower some of the barriers to entry for philanthropy, particularly maybe in using technology. Lucy, let's come to you on some of those.
So as a politician, I of course agree with all of you, even though you have said different things. But I think you can draw some threads, even though you have said slightly different things. I do think there's a commonality of a role for government, but not overtaking you. So I agree, I am the champion for philanthropy. And I am championing it. And I'm championing it at every level across government, with different departments, with philanthropists, and broader. I mean, I've spoken to the American ambassador about it, I've spoken to the arts, I represent the arts, and they fall within my portfolio. So I do believe that in DCMS, with my responsibility for charities and the arts and social investment funding and the dormant assets, there is a real drawing together of threads that means that my department is the right one to champion this. And as the Secretary of State, I take that role very seriously. In terms of government's role or not government's role, I think the position is that government has a deep role, but it should not put itself where it is not wanted and not needed, and it should be a facilitator of others. And that others should be the grassroots giving, and these partnerships that are evolving. We should be there. You know, we support, in Jason's example, you know, the dormant assets funding, which, you know, my department has engagement with, is responsible for, you know, some of collecting that money together from others. So it's not dormant assets funding, which funds a lot of good causes, is not government money, but government encourages banks and others to give to it through the scheme. It then has pots of money which individuals can then access. So that's how I see government's role. It's the facilitator to bring together networks. And I think that's the answer to your question as well, which is government has a role. And an example might be, so Lord Johnson, who's a minister in DBT, so the Department for Business and Trade, is bringing together people who, individuals or companies who might want to invest from a business perspective through philanthropy into interesting ideas of the future that might not get commercial or government funding. So we've done quite a lot of work of bringing these people together to ensure that they know where the connections are and then explore them themselves. I think the point about culture is phenomenally important, but I'll let others come in and maybe come back if it's raised again.
Very good. In fact, let me then address that question to you, Paul. I'm curious how you think about this question of the kind of culture around wealth. I mean, obviously the Wolfson Foundation, they're quite comfortable with and happy with using their story and bringing their story to the fore, but how can we encourage more people to do that?
Well, first of all, I think we do need to recognise that different philanthropists have different motivations. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. For some, they won't want the left hand to know what the right hand is doing. And so I think, you know, a set model that sort of insists that all philanthropists should be on the front foot probably doesn't work. But I think encouraging those who are willing to talk about it, to put their stories in the public domain and to think about the ways to celebrate that is a good thing. I'm also going to say something perhaps that's a bit more controversial, and that is, you know, the report heralds the rise of donor-advised funds. I'm conscious of the gentleman sitting to my right. And, you know, they have been very good in many ways. What they have done, though, is allowed a layer of anonymity to creep in. So whereas in the 1950s, when the Wolfson family set up a foundation, you set it up as a public body, you registered it, and it became a public entity. And increasingly, we have to report on it. Actually now you're much more likely to go to a donor-advised fund and fund through there, and that gives you complete anonymity. Now, I'm not saying that intrinsically is a bad thing, or that every philanthropist should set up something like a foundation, But if we don't have enough willing to go on the front foot, then we don't have exemplars. We don't have people who are willing to talk about the benefits and the joys as well as the challenges of giving. So I do think there is something to think about there. I also feel as though we probably as a society just need to get away from the cynicism. Because, you know, as well as the culture, I think it is active. I mean, Beth Breeze has done some work on this, and Shivani hinted at it in the report. I think it is beginning to act as a disincentive for people to give generously and at high levels. And the answer to that, I think, is a little bit more complicated.
Neil, your thoughts on this, and also on Juliet's question about kind of the government's role in lifting some of the barriers to entry, maybe, for philanthropy?
Blimey, those are big questions. I guess, can I get your question about the barriers? AI is an unbelievable opportunity because fundamentally what you're describing is at a sectoral level. How do you understand what money's coming in, where it's going, and what impact it's having? And then being able to present that in a coherent way in order to encourage others to follow suit. Right? Fundamentally, that's what you're trying to do. And that has been the inability to do that as we stand today is a huge inhibitor to the outcomes that we all want to see. AI gives us the potential to start to think about that. And ironically, we're actually launching some research on Monday from CAF about the risks and opportunities that the public see in charity adoption of AI. And there's a big conference in Seattle with Microsoft that, where we're going to be talking a little about some of these things. I guess what that poses is questions for the sector about what is the line of sight to create what has never been there before and could now be created and could probably be created pretty quickly, right? That's probably about it. And I'd be very happy to follow up with you and talk, and there's going to be a bunch of stuff on that next week. I think on this, we British are beautifully schizophrenic, right? You know, we look to America and we say, how is it that they give whatever it is, $500 billion a year, somewhere between 25 and 30 billion of that to places other than America, by the way. And we kind of like that. What can we import? And there's a piece of this in the Onward report. And then there's this very important and legitimate and key concern about expectations of transparency and line of sight. And there's a balance between those two things in the way that we think about it. We encourage all of the people that use our donor services to be wholly transparent about what they're doing, when they're doing, why they're doing it, largely because we think it's fantastic and it's likely to provide an example to others. And I'm thrilled that many of them choose to do exactly that. Others, however, are concerned. They're concerned about the corrosive cynicism. They're concerned about the media. They're concerned about the sector chasing them for more, and their concern about discretion and being in control of that news is in their hands. And from our point of view as a service provider, what we seek to do is to support others to get more money into the sector, to do it safely, efficiently, and effectively. Encourage them to shout about it. But if they don't want to shout about it, then you know what? We would regard that as their right. Now, how you then deal with the aggregation in reporting. I love 360-degree giving. I think it's a fabulous data source, and embedding it more broadly. I think it's brought a lot to the sector, and I think there's a lot more to go. In what we think should happen for a national philanthropy and charitable giving strategy, there's a focus on individual giving all the way through everyday giving. There's a focus on workplace giving, which speaks to the corporations. We haven't talked at all that the FTE 100 in the last 7 years proportionately have gone back by 26% in terms of their giving. At a time where profits have tripled, things have stagnated. The load that our companies are shouldering, I think needs some proper scrutiny, quite frankly. Individual giving, workplace giving, place-based giving, this people's emotional connection in the way that Jason spoke so evocatively about for Grimsby, and good luck with the season, by the way. I think the fourth element of this is really a challenge for Lucy in her role about, and you have absolutely championed from the departmental point of view, but we all know because that government is complicated and disjointed, and what is replicated in some places is not replicated in others, and I think there's some real thought around the plumbing of the way the government think about this that I would advocate is made. But the critical thing is data that informs all of those things. And in this century with AI, we've got to collectively expose the data coherently.
Jason, let me come to you on this question about the role of the government. I want to broaden it out slightly. I mean, you will have in your area in Grimsby you've got Levelling Up Partnerships, Levelling Up Fund, Towns Fund, Future High Streets Fund, Long-Term Plan for Towns.
It's coming apparently. I mean, the principle, the money hasn't turned up yet.
Yeah. There you go. I'm now on the hook for some of that, I think. So how do you think about, all of those things, that some of that investment coming in, the role that government are playing, which bits of it are really helpful and are good for your place and your work as a philanthropist, and which bits do you think, actually, it'd be great if you just got out of the way here a little bit?
Well, very little of the get out of the way, actually, and I couldn't agree less with the comment about the dead hand of government. I think the reason we've got the report is the failure of the philanthropy market. And we're seeing this, there's a deficit, right, and there's an opportunity. So I think the role of government has been characterised, which is setting signals and setting projects that people can give an easy yes to. So I think, again, I go on about this a lot, but I think Onside's a great model where you have private funding and infrastructure that tempts people like me in, because it doesn't have to become a full-time job for me, it can be part of what I do. And then that has the confidence of government to pile in behind that and fund that, whether that's local funding or with national funding in the case of the Grimsby. So I think, the problems that we have in places like Grimsby are intergenerational. The industrial decline started in the 70s, the poverty that we're seeing and the wealth inequality that's going to be further inhibited by AI, and I'm an investor in AI. That's what I do when I'm not trying to get Grimsby Town up the league table. Thank you for that. But I think the role of government is really important, because it sets a really clear intent that this is important. And as a partner, right, if you're saying to someone like me, the government's coming here, but they're trying to raise private funding, there isn't a better investor for us to step behind, I think, often. So I don't think it's not socialist vision for philanthropy by any means the way, as someone that was born in Grimsby in the 70s, I imagine you can think of my political persuasion. But I think there is a great role for government to signal a clear strategy about where help is needed, so that private investors can come behind that and partner with that as a signal this is serious to the nation, and it will be there for the long term as well. I think to the question of secrecy and slight embarrassment, I think that's a generational cultural thing, and I do think of that as a problem. The genuine reason I'm here today is that I thought twice about it, because it just doesn't feel British. It doesn't feel like someone from Grimsby should be speaking like this. The work I'm doing with Emily Bolton, who is my inspiration in this sector and my partner now, the organisation that we founded together, called Our Future, is about making sure that the experiments we're trying in Grimsby are data-led and replicable, so that they can inform policy and can be replicated in other towns up and down the UK as well. So we're taking a scientific method to this social intervention. And the final thing I would say, that wasn't the question, was as an investor in air, I'd ask that question to ChatGPT. Seriously, that will give you an answer now, right? and then keep iterating on that. I think if you when we came to this work, my wife and I 6-7 years ago, we got some reasonable advice, but it's really the straightforward is finding something that isn't transactional and will be a project for you in a short term. Find something that you care about for the rest of your life, and build relationships with people who will go on that journey with you. And that's the thing that's been a really simple guiding light for me. And importantly, it's given me an easy no, because I don't do anything, I don't have to say yes to anything that's not going to impact Grimsby first and foremost. So it gave me a framework to operate in as well.
Thank you so much. Shivani, do you want to jump in?
If I could quickly jump in on Grant's question on culture, I think from philanthropist to philanthropist, it depends on how disruptive they want to be, how public they want to be. We're seeing a new wave of young tech millionaires that want to be seen on the forefront. They want to have a personal relationship with the charity they're engaging with. And general millennial and Gen Z attitudes towards philanthropy and towards charitable giving are a lot more personal. So I'm optimistic about the direction in which it's headed.
What happens when move fast, break things meets philanthropy? Okay, so
Adam, could I just add one very quick example of some of the things? Immediately after COVID, a whole bunch of things happened that everyone said was impossible, that provided some interesting insights. The one example that really leapt out to me was in those first few weeks of the terrifying bit, when no one knew anything. Several of our high net worth individuals came together, cobbled together 5 million quid that got bunged out to support very, very small local organisations just to help them survive the next few months. That then ended up with us shopping that, looking for businesses to support. The Association of British Insurers came behind that. 37 of their members ponied up 84 million quid. We then together partnered with DCMS, who ponied up through their community match challenge another 20 million quid. All of a sudden there was 110 million quid that was coming from different places, from different reasons, and it got channeled into a 3-year program of Survive, Adapt and Thrive that extended support literally to hundreds of thousands of organisations. It would not have happened without those different communities together coming in those circumstances to do something that previously wasn't going to work. And it's really made us think very profoundly about how do we change our organisation to help to support that sentiment to do more of that going forward. And I think, for business, for individuals, for government, I would offer it as a really interesting example for us all to reflect on to achieve some of the things we've talked about.
Thank you very much, Neil. So I've done a terrible job at chairing. We are 5 minutes over and I've only taken 3 questions. No, quite all right. I mean, there's a huge amount that the panelists I think have added to the discussion, and I want to end now because I think actually there's a huge amount of kind of energy and curiosity in this room. So if you don't know the person next to you or you don't know them very well, please do stick around for 2 minutes afterwards, say hello, because you are both here because you are interested in this topic and likely working on things that will be complementary. So please do talk to each other afterwards. If we're going to break British taboos today, let's break that one as well. I want to say a few quick thank yous. One is a massive thank you to Peter Felix, a philanthropist who actually supported this research. So, in some ways, Onward is a not-for-profit, and so this has been helpful thinking about how we raise funds for our organisation. But Peter came to us because he felt there was a lot of low-hanging fruit in the philanthropic space, and he wanted to see research that he felt would influence policy, and hopefully today is a vindication of that. He's travelling at the moment, so couldn't be here today. But I want to say a massive thank you to Peter. And secondly, a big thank you to all the organisations that spoke to us. We held 2 roundtables right at the start of this, and we're really overwhelmed by all of the organisations, academics, think tanks, and others that participated. So thank you to everyone that came along to those and who contributed. And finally, if you would all join me in thanking our panellists, and particularly the Secretary of State for sharing her time with us today. So thank you very much.